It was a quiet afternoon in the park, the sound of children laughing and birds chirping filling the air. A young black boy, no older than 13, was walking home, his backpack slung over his shoulder and a bright smile on his face. But what started as an ordinary day quickly turned into a nightmare. A police officer, fueled by prejudice and assumptions, fixated on the boy for no apparent reason. Moments later, the officer pulled out his taser, the sharp crackle of electricity breaking the serene park atmosphere, and fired. The boy's body jerked, and he collapsed to the ground, his face filled with confusion and pain. He couldn't understand why this was happening to him. Little did the officer know, his reckless act of injustice wouldn't go unnoticed. What he also didn't realize was the boy's father, someone he would regret crossing, was on his way. Before we dive deeper into this intense story, let's take a moment to hear from you, our incredible viewers. Drop a comment below and let us know your name and where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and you are an essential part of this channel's growth. Your likes, comments, and engagement help us bring more stories to light, and we value each and every one of you deeply. Now, get ready to uncover what happened next in this shocking and unforgettable tale. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the park as a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, mixing with the chirping of birds and the rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot. Among the cheerful noises of the day, a young black boy, around 13 years old, walked along the main path with a backpack slung over one shoulder. His steps were light, carefree, as he hummed a tune he'd heard earlier on the radio. It had been a good day at school, a rare day where everything seemed to go right. He'd aced his history quiz, joked with his friends at lunch, and managed to avoid the last-minute chaos of forgotten homework. Now, with the rest of the afternoon ahead of him, he looked forward to relaxing at home. The park was his usual shortcut, a path he'd taken countless times before without a second thought. It was his bridge between the structured world of school and the calm refuge of his home. As he walked, he occasionally kicked a pebble along the path, smiling as it skipped ahead of him. The park was alive with activity. A group of kids played tag near the swings, their laughter bright and infectious. A jogger passed by with earbuds in, nodding politely as they shared the path. An older couple sat on a bench, feeding pigeons and chatting quietly. The boy liked moments like this, ordinary, peaceful, filled with the kind of simplicity that made him feel safe and at ease. He adjusted his backpack, feeling the familiar weight of his books and snacks inside, and reached into his pocket to check his phone. A few notifications from his friends flashed on the screen, and he smiled, already planning to reply once he got home. For now, though, he wanted to enjoy the quiet rhythm of his walk, the way the world seemed to slow down in this little corner of the park. Little did he know, the calm serenity of this ordinary afternoon was about to be shattered. Just ahead, unseen and unnoticed, a shadow of prejudice lingered. What began as a peaceful walk home was about to take a turn he could never have anticipated. As the boy continued his walk, a police officer leaned against the side of his patrol car parked just off the main path. The officer's sunglasses reflected the bright sunlight, and his posture was casual, one hand resting on his utility belt, the other holding a cup of coffee. He scanned the park absent-mindedly, watching the families and joggers pass by, a routine part of his midday patrol. Then his gaze fell on the boy. The officer straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing behind the reflective lenses. At first, it was nothing more than a passing glance, but something about the boy seemed to hold his attention. His body language shifted, from relaxed observation to a tense, focused scrutiny. He set the coffee cup down on the hood of his car, his fingers brushing instinctively against the taser on his belt. The boy, unaware of the officer's gaze, kept walking, his posture calm and casual. He adjusted the strap of his backpack again, glancing briefly at a group of kids playing tag nearby. But to the officer, these simple, innocent actions seemed to mean something entirely different. In his mind, assumptions began to form. The boy's presence, his movements, the way he carried himself, they were enough to trigger a deeply ingrained bias, a whisper of suspicion that quickly grew louder. "Why is he walking alone?" the officer muttered under his breath. "What's he up to?" He took a step away from the car, his boots crunching against the gravel path. His hand remained close to his taser, a reflexive move that he justified to himself as being prepared, just in case. His gaze followed the boy's every step, dissecting his movements, looking for anything at all, that could confirm the narrative building in his mind. The boy, oblivious to the tension growing behind him, stopped briefly to tie his shoelace. He crouched down near the edge of the path, unaware that the simple act had drawn even more scrutiny. To the officer, the boy's pause looked calculated, suspicious. The officer's breath quickened as he reached for his radio, his voice calm but firm. "Suspicious individual, young male, mid-teens, black, carrying a backpack. Observing. Potential loitering or disturbance," he reported. The officer began to walk toward the boy, his boots heavy against the ground, his movements purposeful. Each step carried the weight of his assumptions, the prejudice that had taken root so deeply within him. The peace of the park, the boy's innocent afternoon stroll, all of it was about to unravel under the officer's watchful, judgmental eye. The officer's steps quickened as he moved closer to the boy, his mind already racing with baseless conclusions. To him, the boy's mere presence in the park at this time of day seemed out of place. He didn't consider that the boy could be walking home from school or simply enjoying the sunny afternoon like everyone else. Instead, the officer's thoughts were clouded by suspicion, fed by ingrained prejudices he didn't even recognize within himself. The boy, still unaware of the officer's focus on him, stood up after tying his shoe and adjusted his backpack. He glanced around briefly, taking in the sights of the park, before continuing along the path. His movements were calm and natural, but to the officer, they seemed calculated, deliberate. Every small gesture was interpreted as part of some imagined intent. "Why does he keep looking around?" the officer muttered under his breath, his brow furrowing. In reality, the boy was simply enjoying the scenery, but the officer's bias twisted it into something far more sinister. "What's he hiding in that backpack?" he wondered, his eyes narrowing. The officer's mind filled with questions, none of which were grounded in reality. Why was the boy alone? Was he up to something? Was he carrying something illegal? The officer had no reason to believe any of this, but his biases whispered otherwise, convincing him that his suspicions were justified. He reached for his radio again, this time speaking with more urgency. "I'm approaching a suspect," he said, his tone clipped and official. "Black male, mid-teens, possibly carrying contraband. Acting suspiciously in the vicinity of families and children." The boy, now sensing the weight of someone's gaze, turned his head slightly and saw the officer walking toward him. His steps faltered for a moment, his casual ease replaced with a flicker of uncertainty. Why was the officer looking at him like that? He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't even interacted with anyone. The officer, interpreting the boy's hesitation as guilt or fear, felt his assumptions harden into convictions. "He knows I'm onto him," he thought, his hand brushing against the taser at his hip. To him, the boy's nervous glance wasn't the natural reaction of a teenager surprised to see a police officer, it was evidence of wrongdoing. The boy slowed his steps, unsure whether to stop or keep walking. He didn't want to appear disrespectful, but something about the officer's intense stare made his stomach tighten with unease. Little did he know, no action he could take would have changed the narrative already playing out in the officer's mind. The boy's peaceful afternoon had become a target of unwarranted suspicion, and the consequences of that moment were about to unfold in a way he could never have expected. The officer closed the distance between them, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel path. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on the boy, who now stood frozen in place. The once carefree expression on the teenager's face had faded, replaced by a look of confusion and growing apprehension. "Hey, you," the officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The boy flinched slightly at the suddenness of the call, but turned around, his hand still clutching the straps of his backpack. His brow furrowed in confusion as he tried to understand why he was being singled out. "Yes, sir," the boy replied hesitantly, his voice respectful but tinged with uncertainty. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing at the officer's stern expression. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded, his tone accusatory rather than curious. He stopped a few feet away, looming over the boy with a posture that exuded authority. His eyes scanned the boy from head to toe, as though searching for something incriminating. The boy hesitated, confused by the question. I'm just walking home, sir," he said cautiously, his voice steady but soft. He gestured toward the path ahead. "I always take this shortcut through the park after school." The officer didn't relax. Instead, he took a step closer, narrowing his eyes. "Don't play games with me," he said, his voice lowering but growing colder. "What's in the bag?" The boy instinctively tightened his grip on his backpack straps, his heart beginning to race. "It's just my school stuff," he explained, his tone growing more anxious. "Books, lunchbox, nothing else." "Open it," the officer snapped, cutting him off. His words were not a request, but a command. The boy's eyes widened slightly, his mind racing. He had nothing to hide, but the officer's sharp tone and aggressive stance made his chest tighten. Slowly, he slid the backpack off his shoulder, fumbling slightly as he unzipped it. He began to pull out the contents, laying them out carefully, a couple of textbooks, a notebook, a water bottle, and a sandwich wrapped in foil. "There's nothing here," the boy said softly, looking up at the officer, hoping this would end the encounter. But the officer's gaze didn't soften. Instead, he crossed his arms and took another step closer, looming even more. "You expect me to believe that's all you've got? Why were you acting suspicious, then?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. The boy's confusion deepened. "I wasn't acting suspicious," he said, his voice trembling now. "I was just walking." The officer's jaw tightened. He didn't believe him. He didn't want to. And the boy, standing there under the weight of the officer's gaze, realized that no explanation he could give would change the man's mind. The officer scoffed, shaking his head as he stared down at the boy. His lips curled into a sneer, and his tone shifted from authoritative to mocking. "You expect me to believe you're just an innocent little kid walking home," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't lie to me. I know your type." The boy flinched at the words, his hands tightening around the straps of his backpack. "My type?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible. He felt the sting of those words, though he wasn't entirely sure what the officer meant. Deep down, he feared he already knew. "Yes, your type," the officer snapped, leaning closer. "Walking around like you own the place, acting like you're above the rules. You think no one notices?" The boy's face burned with humiliation. His heart raced as he tried to find the right words to respond, but every attempt died in his throat. The officer's gaze bore into him, judgmental and unforgiving, making it clear that nothing he said would matter. "Bet you think you're clever," the officer continued, smirking now. "But I see right through you. Wandering around here with that backpack, pretending you're just another student. What are you hiding, huh?" "I'm not hiding anything," the boy said softly, his voice trembling. He tried to hold his ground, but the weight of the officer's accusations made him feel smaller with every word. The officer let out a harsh laugh. "Yeah, right. Kids like you always have an excuse, don't they? Always someone else's fault, always innocent. You're just waiting for the right moment to cause trouble." Tears pricked the corners of the boy's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He clenched his fists at his sides, swallowing the lump in his throat. Every word felt like a blow, cutting deeper into his sense of dignity. The officer wasn't just accusing him, he was stripping away his humanity, reducing him to a stereotype he had no control over. "Look at you," the officer added, his voice filled with disdain. "Scared now, huh? Good. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before acting suspicious." The boy remained silent, his head slightly bowed, his face flushed with a mix of shame and frustration. He wanted to defend himself, to shout that he hadn't done anything wrong, but he knew it would only make things worse. So he stood there, bearing the brunt of the officer's words, his confidence shrinking with every passing moment. The boy stood frozen, his small frame seeming to shrink under the officer's towering presence. His breath quickened, his chest rising and falling as panic set in. His hands clutched the straps of his backpack tightly, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to say something, anything, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat, tangled with fear. His mind raced. What had he done to deserve this? Why was the officer treating him like a criminal when all he'd done was walk home from school? The more he thought about it, the harder it became to breathe. The officer's cold, judgmental stare only made it worse, a silent reminder of the power imbalance between them. I swear I'm not doing anything wrong, the boy stammered, his voice barely audible. He tried to meet the officer's gaze, but quickly looked away, unable to withstand the intensity of it. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that it drowned out the sounds of the park around him. The officer smirked, clearly feeding off the boy's fear. "Oh, you're not doing anything wrong?" he said mockingly, taking a step closer. "Then why do you look so nervous?" "Huh? Only guilty people act like this." "I'm not," the boy tried to say, but his voice broke, trembling with emotion. He took a small step back, his legs unsteady, and glanced around the park, hoping someone might come to his aid. But the other park-goers kept their distance, their faces turned away, unwilling to get involved. Tears began to well up in the boy's eyes, though he fought to hold them back. He couldn't show weakness, not now. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, but the officer's presence loomed larger with every second. The boy felt trapped, like a mouse cornered by a predator. I don't understand," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking. "What did I do?" The officer sneered, his tone cold and dismissive. "You're lucky I'm even giving you a chance to explain yourself," he said, ignoring the boy's question entirely. "But keep acting like this, and we'll see where that gets you." The boy's fear deepened, his body trembling as he struggled to process what was happening. The peaceful walk home he'd looked forward to had turned into a nightmare, and he couldn't see a way out. The officer's posture grew even more rigid, his voice louder and sharper, slicing through the boy's fragile composure. He took another step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel, the sound unnervingly harsh in the otherwise quiet park. The boy instinctively stepped back, his hands trembling as they gripped his backpack. The gap between them shrank, and the air felt heavy with tension. "Don't move," the officer barked, his tone commanding and unforgiving. The boy froze mid-step, his body stiffening as though the weight of the officer's words had paralyzed him. His eyes widened with panic, darting around the park, searching desperately for someone, anyone, who might help. But the other park-goers kept their distance, their silence amplifying the boy's sense of isolation. "You think I'm playing games with you," the officer snarled, his hand hovering dangerously close to the taser on his belt. The boy's breath caught in his throat as he watched the officer's every move, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. "I'm not. I didn't do anything," the boy stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The fear in his tone was unmistakable, but the officer seemed to interpret it as guilt. "You're acting suspicious," the officer growled. "You've got something to hide. What is it, huh? Drugs? Stolen property?" He leaned in closer, his presence oppressive, his accusations growing more pointed and baseless. "No. It's just my school stuff," the boy cried, his voice trembling as tears threatened to spill. He clutched his backpack tighter, trying to shield himself from the accusations, the anger, and the crushing weight of the officer's suspicion. The officer smirked, his tone dripping with disdain. "School stuff, huh? Then why are you shaking? Why do you look like you're about to run? Only people with something to hide act like this." The boy's legs felt weak, his knees threatening to give out as he stood frozen, the officer towering over him. Every word, every gesture from the officer only heightened the boy's fear, pressing down on him like an invisible force. The tension between them thickened, the park's peaceful atmosphere completely shattered by the escalating confrontation. With a deliberate motion, the officer moved his hand to his taser, his fingers resting lightly on it. The boy's breath hitched, his mind racing with panic. The officer's stance, his tone, and the cold steel of his authority made one thing painfully clear: the situation was spiraling out of control, and the boy felt utterly powerless to stop it. The officer's frustration seemed to reach a boiling point as the boy's fear and trembling only solidified the baseless conclusions forming in his mind. Without warning, the officer stepped forward and grabbed the boy's arm with a firm, unyielding grip. The sudden physical contact jolted the boy, his body instinctively recoiling as he gasped in shock. "Stop moving," the officer barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. The boy froze, his arm trapped in the officer's iron grip. The pressure of the hand on his arm was overwhelming, not just in its strength, but in what it represented: complete dominance, total lack of understanding, and the terrifying reality that he was powerless to fight back. "I didn't do anything," the boy protested, his voice breaking as panic bubbled over. He tried to pull his arm free, but the officer tightened his grip, his fingers digging into the boy's small frame. The boy winced at the pain, his eyes wide with terror as tears began to stream down his cheeks. The officer yanked him forward slightly, forcing the boy to face him directly. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the park. "What are you trying to pull, huh? You think you can just walk around acting like this without answering for it?" The boy shook his head frantically, his words spilling out in a panicked rush. "I'm not lying. I swear. Please, I didn't do anything wrong." His voice cracked with desperation, but the officer's grip didn't loosen. Instead, the officer leaned closer, his face twisted in anger and disdain. "Keep resisting, and I'll make this worse for you," the officer warned coldly, his tone laced with menace. His other hand hovered near the taser, the implication clear. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, his breaths coming in short, shallow gasps as he realized just how trapped he was. Nearby, a few passers-by stopped to look, their expressions filled with unease and hesitation. Whispers spread among the onlookers, but none dared to step forward. The boy's eyes darted to them, silently pleading for help, but they averted their gazes, their fear of confrontation stronger than their outrage. The officer, oblivious or indifferent to the growing tension around him, tightened his grip once more. "What's in that bag, kid?" he demanded, shaking the boy slightly. The boy whimpered, his voice barely audible as he repeated, "Nothing, just books." The moment was suffocating, the boy's body stiff and trembling under the officer's control. The grip on his arm was more than physical, it was a crushing weight of fear, powerlessness, and injustice that seemed to freeze time itself. The officer's grip on the boy's arm tightened further, his expression hardening as he made a deliberate move to assert his dominance. With one swift motion, he yanked the boy closer, forcing him to stumble forward. The boy winced, his face contorted in pain, as he struggled to keep his balance. "You think you can play games with me?" the officer barked, his voice loud and commanding, echoing across the park. His free hand moved to his taser, unclipping it from his belt with an exaggerated motion, ensuring that the boy and anyone nearby could see it clearly. The sight of the weapon made the boy's eyes widen in terror, his body trembling as he tried to pull away, but the officer held him firm. "This is what happens when you don't cooperate," the officer growled, holding the taser up in a way that left no doubt about his willingness to use it. The boy's breath came in quick, shallow gasps, his heart pounding as he stared at the weapon, fear washing over him like a tidal wave. I'm not resisting, the boy cried, his voice cracking as tears spilled down his cheeks. Please, I didn't do anything wrong. But the officer didn't seem to hear him. He was too focused on making a show of his authority, his posture radiating power and control. He held the taser just inches away from the boy's chest, the faint crackle of electricity from the device filling the air. The sound alone was enough to send chills down the boy's spine, each spark a reminder of how helpless he was. The officer smirked slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching in satisfaction. See this, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. This is what happens when you don't listen. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before causing trouble. Around them, a small group of onlookers had gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and unease. Some whispered to each other, their voices hushed but urgent. He's just a kid, one of them murmured, but no one stepped forward. The fear of challenging the officer, of becoming a target themselves, kept them rooted in place. The boy's knees buckled slightly, his body trembling under the weight of the moment. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, his mind frozen in sheer panic. The officer, emboldened by the boy's silence and the lack of intervention from the crowd, leaned in closer, his tone turning cold and final. You've got one last chance to tell me the truth, he said, his voice low but threatening. Otherwise, you'll learn exactly what this feels like. The boy's sobs were barely audible now, his entire body shaking as he braced for the worst. The officer's display of power had turned the peaceful park into a scene of raw fear and unchecked authority, a chilling reminder of how far prejudice and intimidation could go. The officer's patience snapped, his face hardening with resolve as he raised the taser, its sharp, crackling sound slicing through the tense air. The boy's eyes widened in sheer terror as he realized what was about to happen. His hands shot up instinctively, palms out, as if trying to shield himself from the inevitable. Please. No. I didn't. The boy's desperate plea was cut off as the officer pulled the trigger. The taser fired with a sharp pop, and the boy's body convulsed as the electric prongs struck his chest. A jolt of electricity surged through him, causing his limbs to jerk uncontrollably. He collapsed to the ground with a thud, his cries of pain turning into short, choked gasps as the current coursed through his small frame. The park seemed to fall silent for a moment, the cheerful sounds of children playing and birds chirping replaced by the eerie crackle of the taser. Onlookers froze in place, their faces painted with shock and disbelief. A woman clutched her child tightly, whispering, "Oh my God," while others exchanged horrified glances. The boy lay sprawled on the ground, his body trembling from the lingering effects of the shock. His face was streaked with tears, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as he tried to process the overwhelming pain and fear. He looked up at the officer with wide, pleading eyes, his voice barely a whisper. Why? I didn't do anything. The officer loomed over him, the taser still in his hand, its faint crackle a menacing reminder of his power. His expression was cold and unrepentant, as if he believed his actions were entirely justified. Maybe next time, you'll learn to cooperate, he said, his tone void of sympathy. Around them, the crowd began to stir. A man stepped forward, his fists clenched, but stopped short, his courage wavering under the weight of the officer's authority. This is wrong, someone muttered, but no one dared to intervene directly. The boy remained on the ground, his small frame trembling as he curled into himself, trying to shield what little dignity he had left. His world had turned into a nightmare, the pain in his body matched only by the crushing weight of humiliation and fear. And the officer, standing tall and unyielding, seemed oblivious to the injustice of his actions, his grip on the taser firm and unmoving. The boy lay on the cold, hard ground, his body trembling uncontrollably as the aftershocks of the taser subsided. His chest heaved with labored breaths, each inhale accompanied by a sharp, searing pain that radiated through his body. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the dirt on his cheeks, but he barely noticed. The fear and humiliation he felt far outweighed the physical agony. He tried to move, to push himself up, but his muscles refused to cooperate. The sharp tingling left by the electric current lingered in his limbs, making every attempt to shift feel like a monumental effort. His hands trembled as he clutched at the grass beneath him, trying to ground himself in a reality that felt increasingly unreal. The officer's towering figure loomed above him, casting a shadow that seemed to envelop the boy entirely. He flinched when the officer took a step closer, his instinct screaming at him to run, to get away, but his body remained frozen in place, paralyzed by pain and terror. I didn't do anything," the boy managed to choke out between gasps, his voice weak and shaky. His words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of his desperation. He couldn't understand why this was happening to him. All he had done was walk home, the same way he always did. The officer's expression remained cold and impassive, his grip on the taser firm as he looked down at the boy with disdain. "Stop acting like a victim," he snapped, his tone devoid of empathy. "Maybe if you just listened, this wouldn't have happened." The boy's tears came harder now, the words cutting deeper than the pain of the taser. He wanted to scream, to tell the officer how wrong he was, but his voice failed him, trapped somewhere between his heart and his throat. All he could do was lie there, trembling and powerless, as the weight of the situation bore down on him. The park, once a place of peace and joy, now felt suffocating, its open spaces closing in around him. The distant laughter of children and the rustling of leaves seemed mocking now, reminders of a world that had continued to move on, oblivious to his suffering. Through his blurred vision, he saw people in the distance, shadows of onlookers frozen in place, their faces etched with shock and uncertainty. He felt their eyes on him, felt the weight of their pity and fear, but none of them stepped forward. The realization that no one would help him only deepened his despair, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. The boy closed his eyes tightly, his chest still heaving, his mind filled with one haunting question: why me? As the boy lay trembling on the ground, a small crowd began to gather at a cautious distance. Their faces were a mix of shock, unease, and hesitation, as though they couldn't quite process what they had just witnessed. Some whispered to one another in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the boy's ragged breathing. "Did he really just taste that kid?" one man murmured, his brow furrowed with disbelief. "He's just a boy," a woman whispered, clutching her child's hand tightly as if to shield them from the scene. "Why would he do that?" Despite their murmurs of outrage, no one stepped forward. Their feet remained rooted in place, their eyes darting between the boy on the ground and the officer standing tall and imposing above him. The officer's presence seemed to radiate an unspoken warning, a reminder of the authority he wielded. A teenager standing near the swings pulled out their phone, nervously recording the scene. Their hands shook as they tried to focus on the boy, his tear-streaked face visible even from a distance. "This isn't right," they muttered to themselves, but their voice lacked the courage to rise above the whispers. Others looked away, unable to meet the boy's tearful eyes or the officer's cold gaze. A jogger, who had stopped mid-run, shifted uncomfortably before turning back down the path, clearly unwilling to involve themselves further. "We should call someone," an elderly man muttered, his hand gripping a cane tightly. But even as he spoke, he didn't reach for his phone, his expression a mix of fear and resignation. The boy, through his tear-blurred vision, caught glimpses of the crowd. He saw their worried faces, their darting eyes, their half-hidden gestures of outrage. But none of it translated into action. The distance they kept from him felt like a wall, isolating him further, their inaction amplifying his sense of helplessness. The officer, sensing the unease in the crowd, turned and glared at them, his body language radiating control. "Step back," he barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. "This doesn't concern you." The onlookers flinched at his tone, some taking hesitant steps backward. One woman opened her mouth as if to protest, but quickly closed it, shaking her head as she pulled her child closer and moved away. The boy felt his heart sink further. He had hoped, even prayed, that someone might intervene, that someone would speak up for him, but the fear in their eyes told him otherwise. They were witnesses, yes, but they were also bystanders, caught in the same web of intimidation that now held him captive. The weight of their silence was crushing, almost as heavy as the officer's presence. It was a stark reminder that in moments of injustice, even the many can be rendered powerless by fear of the few. The officer, still looming over the boy, turned his gaze toward the small crowd that had gathered. He could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment seeping into the tense atmosphere. For a brief moment, his confidence wavered, but he quickly masked it with an air of authority. Straightening his posture, he raised his voice, addressing the onlookers in a tone that demanded compliance. This was necessary, he declared firmly, gesturing toward the boy on the ground. He was acting suspicious, and I followed protocol. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke up. The officer's gaze swept over them, daring anyone to challenge his words. "You don't know the full story," he continued, his tone sharp and defensive. He was resisting. I gave him multiple warnings to cooperate. The boy, still struggling to catch his breath, managed to raise his head slightly. "I didn't resist," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. But the officer ignored him, his attention fixed on the crowd. "Do you know how dangerous situations like this can get?" the officer added, his voice growing louder, more insistent. "If I hadn't acted, who knows what could have happened? My job is to protect this community, and that's exactly what I did." A man in the crowd crossed his arms, frowning. "He's just a kid," he muttered, loud enough for the officer to hear. "What could he have done to deserve that?" The officer's jaw tightened, his grip on the taser firm as he turned his full attention to the man. "You weren't here from the start," he snapped. "You don't know what I saw. Kids like this," he paused, catching himself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. "They can be unpredictable. I had to make a split-second decision to ensure everyone's safety." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, but no one stepped forward. The officer could feel the tension rising, the weight of their doubt pressing against his authority. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to sound calm and rational. "Look," he said, gesturing again to the boy, whose tear-streaked face and trembling frame painted a stark contrast to the officer's words. "This is about maintaining order. Sometimes that means making tough calls." The crowd remained uncertain, their eyes flicking between the boy and the officer. Some nodded reluctantly, swayed by the uniform and the forcefulness of his words, while others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to act. The boy, meanwhile, lowered his head again, the pain of the moment deepened by the officer's attempts to justify what had happened. As the officer turned back to the boy, his expression hardened further. Despite the boy lying on the ground, trembling and clearly in pain, the officer's tone grew sharper, more cutting. His voice dripped with disdain as he began to hurl insults, each word digging deeper into the boy's already shattered sense of self. "Look at you," the officer sneered, shaking his head. "Crying like a baby. You think tears are going to get you out of this? Pathetic." The boy flinched, his breath hitching as he tried to stifle his sobs. His arms instinctively curled around his body, as though trying to shield himself from the verbal blows that now replaced the physical ones. "This is what happens when you don't respect authority," the officer continued, his voice growing colder. "Walking around like you own the place. You should have known better. But I guess someone like you never learns, huh?" The boy's shoulders shook as silent tears streamed down his face. He wanted to scream, to shout that he hadn't done anything wrong, but the weight of the moment crushed his voice before it could escape. Every insult felt like another lash, another reminder of the power imbalance between them. "You think you're innocent? That you're the victim here," the officer spat, leaning down slightly to glare into the boy's tear-filled eyes. "No one's going to believe you. They'll all see you for what you really are, trouble. That's all you'll ever be." The onlookers in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs growing louder. A few looked visibly upset, but still, no one stepped forward. A woman clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white as she whispered to the person next to her, "Why is he saying those things? The poor boy's already hurt." The boy turned his head slightly, glancing at the crowd through blurred vision. He saw their pity, their unease, but no one moved to help him. Their silence cut just as deeply as the officer's words, leaving him feeling utterly alone. The officer stood back up, his smirk returning as he straightened his posture. "Let this be a lesson," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the park. "You don't mess with the law, and you don't ignore my commands. Next time, you'll think twice before stepping out of line." The boy clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to hold onto whatever scraps of dignity he had left. But the officer's words echoed in his mind, each one a cruel reminder of the injustice he was powerless to fight. Unnoticed by the officer, a man standing near the edge of the growing crowd watched the scene intently. His sharp gaze was fixed on the boy lying on the ground, his expression shifting from disbelief to a quiet, simmering anger. Dressed in a crisp suit, he stood out among the casual parkgoers, his presence commanding yet subdued. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he processed what he had just witnessed. The man took a step forward, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel. His face, though calm, betrayed a storm brewing beneath the surface. He recognized the boy immediately, his son. It took everything within him to hold back his emotions, to keep himself from charging forward in that moment. He had taught his son to be strong, to respect others, and to trust in justice. But now, seeing his child curled up on the ground, trembling in pain and humiliation, filled him with a rage he hadn't known he could feel. He glanced around, taking in the crowd's horrified faces and the officer's posture of arrogant authority. No one else had stepped in. No one had dared to challenge what had just unfolded. The man's jaw tightened as he realized it would have to be him. Still unnoticed, he began walking closer, his footsteps steady and deliberate. Each step carried the weight of his resolve, his silent anger growing with every second. He could see the boy's tear-streaked face, his small frame trembling with fear, and it only hardened his determination. As he drew nearer, his sharp eyes locked onto the officer, who was still standing over the boy, his words sharp and condescending. The man's presence was commanding, yet quiet enough not to immediately draw attention. He paused just behind the officer, his gaze piercing. For a moment, he simply stood there, his posture tall and composed, his silence speaking louder than words. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority that made everyone in the vicinity turn toward him. "That's enough," he said, his tone measured but firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. The officer stiffened, caught off guard by the voice. He turned around slowly, his smug expression faltering as his eyes met the man's. The man's calm exterior masked a deep, unrelenting fury, and the weight of his presence shifted the atmosphere entirely. Though the officer didn't yet realize who this man was, something about him immediately commanded respect, or fear. The crowd, sensing the shift, grew quiet, their murmurs dying down as they waited to see what would happen next. Just moments before the man's commanding presence disrupted the scene, one of the onlookers had pulled out their phone. It was a young woman who had been standing near the swings, her hands trembling as she dialed a number she had found in a local community thread. She didn't know the boy personally, but she'd overheard someone in the crowd whisper that they recognized him, that his father was someone who wouldn't take this lightly. The phone rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "This is Mr. Carter." "Sir," the woman began, her voice shaking, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I think it's about your son. He's in the park, there's an officer, and," she faltered, glancing back at the boy lying on the ground, the taser still crackling faintly in the officer's hand. "You need to come quickly. He's been hurt." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when the man spoke again, his voice was calm but laced with urgency. "Which park?" She quickly gave him the location, her heart pounding as she glanced back at the scene. "Please hurry." "The officer, he's being rough with him. People are scared to intervene." "I'm on my way," Mr. Carter said firmly, the line clicking dead before she could say another word. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her eyes returning to the boy. His small, trembling form was etched into her mind, and she couldn't shake the guilt of not doing more. But as she saw the suited man approaching with a controlled but purposeful stride, she felt a flicker of relief. She didn't know him personally, but there was something in his demeanor that promised he wouldn't let this stand. Now, as he stood just feet away from the officer, the atmosphere in the park shifted entirely. The crowd, sensing a change, grew quieter, their collective attention turning to the man who had arrived to defend his son. The officer froze mid-sentence as a commanding voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. A tall, sharply dressed black man, his shoulders square and his expression steely, approached the scene with measured steps. The crowd instinctively parted for him, sensing the quiet authority radiating from his presence. His gaze was fixed on the officer, piercing and unyielding. The officer turned, his brow furrowing as he looked at the man. "And who exactly are you?" he demanded, his tone defensive, though his body language betrayed a flicker of unease. The man stopped just a few feet away, his stance calm but commanding. He ignored the question, his eyes shifting briefly to the boy lying on the ground. His son. The sight of him, trembling, tear-streaked, and humiliated, sent a surge of anger through him, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he took a deep breath, his voice steady but sharp as he spoke. "That boy," he said, gesturing toward his son, "is my child." The officer blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Your child?" "Yes," the man said firmly, his eyes narrowing. "And you're going to explain to me, right now, why my son is lying on the ground in pain, surrounded by onlookers, after being assaulted by you." The officer opened his mouth, fumbling for a response, but the weight of the man's presence and the cold intensity in his voice seemed to steal the words from him. The crowd, which had been murmuring moments before, fell completely silent. All attention was on the father now, their collective unease shifting into something closer to respect and expectation. The boy, hearing his father's voice, looked up weakly. Relief washed over his tear-streaked face as he recognized the familiar figure standing tall against the officer. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. The father's gaze softened for just a moment as he looked at his son, a silent reassurance passing between them. Then his attention snapped back to the officer, his expression hardening once more. "I'm waiting," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the officer's shoulders stiffen. He was acting suspicious," the officer stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "He wasn't cooperating." "Suspicious?" the father interrupted, his tone cutting like ice. "Walking through a park is suspicious now? Carrying a backpack is suspicious?" The officer hesitated, his confidence faltering. He wasn't following instructions. "And that," the father said, his voice rising slightly but remaining controlled, "justifies you using a taser on a child?" The crowd shifted uneasily, their murmurs beginning to pick up again as the man's words struck a chord. The officer glanced around, realizing for the first time that the tide of public opinion was no longer on his side. But the father wasn't done. "This ends now," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and deliberate. "You've already humiliated and hurt my son. You won't make it worse." The officer took an involuntary step back, the authority he'd wielded moments ago slipping away under the weight of the father's presence. The boy watched from the ground, a glimmer of hope replacing the despair he had felt just moments before. His father was here, and the balance of power was beginning to shift, the officer straightened his stance, attempting to reassert his authority. He shifted his hand toward his belt, his fingers brushing the taser as if to remind everyone who was in charge. But the man standing before him didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence filling the space with a calm but unmistakable power. "Step back," the officer ordered, his voice sharp but with a noticeable edge of unease. "You're interfering in a police matter." The father's eyes narrowed, his calm facade barely masking the storm simmering beneath. "This is no longer a police matter," he said, his tone low and cutting. "This is about my son. And you've crossed a line." The crowd, sensing the tension escalating, grew still. The air was thick, every word and movement feeling heavier as the confrontation unfolded. The officer, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at the boy still lying on the ground. "Your son was acting suspicious." "I followed procedure," he said, his voice louder now, as though trying to convince himself as much as the crowd. "Procedure?" the father repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. He took another step forward, forcing the officer to meet his gaze directly. "Your procedure involves tasering a child for walking through a park? For carrying a backpack? Tell me, officer, what exactly did he do that warranted this level of violence?" The officer faltered, his jaw tightening as he struggled for a response. "He wasn't cooperating," he said defensively. "He resisted." "Resisted?" the father snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "Look at him. He's a scared, innocent boy who did nothing wrong. You didn't see resistance, you saw a chance to act on your prejudice." The officer bristled at the accusation, his hand tightening around the taser. "Watch your tone," he warned, though the confidence in his voice had begun to waver. "I don't have to explain myself to you." "Oh, you'll explain," the father said coldly, his composure returning, though his words carried the weight of a promise. "Not just to me, but to every person who's witnessing this. And when you're done explaining here, you'll answer to your department. To the media. To the law." The officer's face flushed, and for a moment he looked around the crowd, realizing just how many eyes were on him. Phones were raised, recording every second of the encounter. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, their disapproval evident. "You've lost control, officer," the father said, his voice steady now, slicing through the officer's defenses like a scalpel. "And you know it. Let me make this clear, this stops now. You're done threatening my son, and you're done abusing your authority." The officer, visibly shaken, took an involuntary step back, his grip on the taser loosening. The father's presence, his unshakable resolve, had turned the tables entirely. What had begun as a display of unchecked power had become a reckoning, the officer now facing the consequences of his actions in real time. The boy, still on the ground, looked up at his father, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and awe. He had never seen someone stand up to authority like this, much less for him. The officer, once so confident and commanding, now looked uncertain, even small, in the face of the truth being laid bare. The officer's bravado faltered as the father stepped even closer, his calm yet commanding presence suffocating any remaining confidence the officer tried to project. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones still raised, capturing every second. The father's gaze was unyielding as he spoke, his words deliberate and piercing. "Do you even know who you're dealing with?" The officer stiffened, his face twitching with a mix of irritation and unease. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, though the words rang hollow. "This is a law enforcement matter, and you're interfering." A faint, almost amused smile tugged at the corners of the father's lips, but his eyes burned with barely contained fury. "Oh, you'll care," he said, his voice low but filled with undeniable authority. "I'm Thomas Carter. Attorney. Civil rights litigator. And this boy you just tasered for no reason? He's my son." The officer's expression shifted in an instant, the confidence draining from his face. His grip on the taser slackened, his hand hovering uncertainly as the weight of the situation hit him. He had heard the name before. Everyone in law enforcement had. Thomas Carter was known for taking on high-profile cases of police misconduct, exposing corruption, and holding officers accountable for abuse of power. And now, the man he had unknowingly wronged was standing right in front of him. You're his father?" the officer stammered, his tone no longer carrying the same edge of authority. "Yes," Mr. Carter replied, his voice growing sharper. "And I'm going to make sure that what you've done here today doesn't go unanswered. You think you can harass and assault a child because of the color of his skin? You think you can hide behind that badge?" The crowd began murmuring again, their voices louder now, emboldened by the father's words. Some of them exchanged glances, nodding in agreement, while others turned their phones toward the officer, capturing every moment of his growing discomfort. The officer shifted on his feet, his face pale. I thought, he began, but Mr. Carter cut him off. "You thought what?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "You thought you could intimidate a defenseless child? That you could use your weapon to enforce your own biases without consequence? Well, you thought wrong." The officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He glanced at the boy, who was still on the ground, his tear-streaked face turned toward his father with a glimmer of hope. The weight of the crowd's judgment, the cameras recording every word, and the realization of who he had crossed pressed down on the officer like a tidal wave. "This isn't over," Mr. Carter said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "You'll explain yourself to me, to your department, and to the law. But first, you're going to apologize to my son." The officer blinked, his face twitching with indignation, but the strength of Mr. Carter's presence left him with no room to resist. The tables had fully turned, and everyone watching knew it. The officer stood frozen, his mind racing as the weight of his actions began to sink in. The name Thomas Carter echoed in his thoughts, bringing with it an overwhelming realization of just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The commanding presence of the man before him, coupled with the boy's tear-streaked face and the crowd's disapproving stares, shattered the facade of authority he had clung to moments earlier. For the first time, he truly looked at the boy, not as a suspect, not through the lens of his own prejudice, but as a frightened child. The bruises forming on the boy's arms, the quivering lips, and the sheer terror in his tear-filled eyes painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The officer's stomach churned as the reality of his actions hit him like a cold wave. He glanced around, his gaze meeting the phones pointed at him. Each camera was a silent witness, capturing his every move, his every word. His earlier confidence had crumbled, replaced by a growing dread. This wasn't just a minor mistake. It was a blatant misuse of power, one that he knew could not be easily explained away. He started, his voice faltering as he looked at Mr. Carter, who stood unflinching, his arms crossed and his expression icy. "I didn't realize. I didn't mean." "You didn't realize what?" Mr. Carter cut him off, his voice sharp and unyielding. "That you were attacking a child? Or that you were projecting your own prejudice onto an innocent boy?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind was flooded with flashes of what had just transpired, the taser, the boy collapsing, the gasps from the crowd. Each image hit him with the force of a hammer, driving home the enormity of his actions. "I was following protocol," the officer tried to say, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. He looked down at the taser in his hand, the weapon that had once made him feel powerful, and for the first time, it felt like a burden. The crowd murmured louder now, their voices filled with indignation and disbelief. "Protocol," someone scoffed. "Since when does protocol involve tasering a kid?" The officer felt his chest tighten. He had been so quick to act, so quick to judge, and now he was being forced to confront the consequences of his blind arrogance. He looked back at the boy, who was clutching his father's leg, seeking comfort and safety. The sight twisted something deep inside him: guilt, shame, regret, emotions he had pushed aside for years. "I made a mistake," the officer finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like they weighed a ton, but they were the first crack in the armor of his denial. He lowered the taser, his hand shaking slightly, and took a small step back. "Damn right you did," Mr. Carter replied, his voice steady but filled with righteous anger. "And you're going to own up to it. Not just to me, but to my son and everyone here who saw what you did." The officer nodded slowly, the magnitude of his errors finally sinking in. His once rigid posture slumped as he realized the fallout that was sure to follow. He had crossed a line, and there would be no escaping the consequences. The air in the park felt heavy as the officer, visibly shaken, stood under the weight of the crowd's judgment and Mr. Carter's unyielding presence. The realization that his actions had spiraled beyond his control was now painfully clear. His attempt to assert authority had transformed into a public reckoning. Mr. Carter wasted no time. "Your badge doesn't give you the right to abuse your power," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the park. "And it won't shield you from accountability." Turning to the onlookers, he addressed the crowd. "Many of you saw what happened here. You witnessed a child being treated like a criminal for simply walking home. If you have footage or any account of what you saw, I urge you to come forward. This officer's behavior will not go unchecked." Several people in the crowd nodded, their phones still recording. A young woman stepped forward hesitantly. "I have the whole thing on video," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "From when he grabbed the boy to when he used the taser." "Good," Mr. Carter replied, offering her a small but reassuring nod. "Please make sure to share that with the authorities and the press." The officer's face paled further. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but the words didn't come. His earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the cold reality that his actions were about to be scrutinized by a force much greater than himself. Mr. Carter took out his phone, dialing quickly. "Yes, this is Thomas Carter," he said into the receiver, his tone calm but purposeful. "I need to report an incident of police misconduct involving the use of excessive force against a minor. It occurred at the East Side Park. Yes, witnesses and video evidence are available." As he spoke, the officer began to backpedal. "Look, I didn't mean for things to go this far," he stammered, his voice tinged with desperation. "I thought—" "You thought wrong," Mr. Carter interrupted, lowering his phone after completing the call. "And now you're going to answer for it. To your department, to the law, and to my son." Moments later, the sound of approaching sirens broke the tense silence. The officer's colleagues arrived, stepping out of their vehicles with wary expressions as they took in the scene. One of them approached cautiously. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the officer, Mr. Carter, and the boy still trembling beside his father. "This officer used a taser on my son without cause," Mr. Carter said, his voice unwavering. "There are witnesses and video evidence. I want him removed from the scene and placed under investigation immediately." The arriving officers exchanged uneasy glances before nodding. "We'll handle it," one of them said, motioning to the officer. "Hand over your taser and badge." The officer hesitated, his face flushed with humiliation as he slowly complied, unhooking his badge and handing over the taser. He glanced at Mr. Carter one last time, but there was no sympathy in the man's eyes, only the cold certainty of justice. As the officer was led away, the crowd erupted in murmurs of approval. The tide had turned, and the once untouchable figure of authority was now held accountable for his actions. The boy, still clutching his father's leg, felt a small sense of relief as he watched the man who had caused him so much fear finally face the consequences. As the officer was escorted away by his colleagues, the crowd erupted with a wave of indignation and outrage. What had started as quiet murmurs grew into a chorus of voices, each one echoing their disbelief at the events they had just witnessed. "How could he do that to a child?" a woman shouted, her voice trembling with anger. She clutched her phone tightly, her video of the incident already saved and ready to share. "This is exactly the kind of abuse we're sick of seeing." A man in the back of the crowd stepped forward, his voice firm and resolute. "This isn't just one bad cop. This is a symptom of something much bigger. If it weren't for his father showing up, who knows how this would have ended?" Others nodded in agreement, their voices overlapping in heated discussion. The injustice of the situation had struck a chord, igniting a collective anger that could no longer be contained. Some spoke of their own experiences with prejudice and discrimination, their words adding to the growing wave of outrage. "This has to stop," another voice rang out, a middle-aged man holding his daughter's hand tightly. "We can't let this happen to our kids, to anyone's kids." Several people were already posting their videos and accounts online. Social media began to buzz with hashtags calling for justice. Clips of the boy trembling on the ground and the officer's aggressive behavior were being shared rapidly, accompanied by captions like, "This could have been anyone's child." And justice for the innocent. Reporters, alerted by the growing online uproar, started to arrive on the scene, cameras in hand. They interviewed witnesses, capturing raw, emotional accounts of what had unfolded in the park. "I saw everything," one young woman said, tears brimming in her eyes. "That boy was just walking home. He didn't do anything wrong, and that officer attacked him like he was a threat. It was disgusting." The father, Mr. Carter, stood resolutely near his son, addressing the reporters with a calm yet powerful tone. "This isn't just about my son," he said firmly. "It's about every child, every person who has ever been targeted because of the color of their skin or the assumptions someone made about them. This ends here." The boy, still shaken but now clinging to his father's side, watched in quiet amazement as strangers rallied behind him, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. Though his body ached and the sting of humiliation lingered, a spark of hope began to flicker within him. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone. The park, once a serene backdrop to a quiet injustice, had transformed into a stage for a collective stand against discrimination and abuse of power. The outrage of the community sent a clear message: enough was enough. The fallout from the incident was swift and unforgiving. Within hours of the videos circulating online, the story had gone viral, drawing national attention. News outlets picked up the footage, replaying the scene of the officer tasering the boy and Mr. Carter's powerful confrontation. The public outcry was immediate and relentless. The police department issued a statement the next morning, acknowledging the incident and confirming that the officer had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The statement was vague, attempting to deflect blame, but it did little to quell the growing anger from the public. Protests were already being organized outside the department's headquarters, with signs reading "Justice for all kids" and "End police brutality now." Behind closed doors, the officer faced mounting pressure from his superiors. His commanding officer, now under scrutiny himself, called him into a private meeting. "You've put this entire department in the spotlight," the commander said coldly, his face a mask of fury. "And not in a good way." The officer sat stiffly, his hands clenched on the table. "I was following procedure," he muttered defensively, but even he knew how hollow the words sounded. "Procedure?" the commander snapped. "Tasing a child for walking home? You've given the department a PR nightmare, not to mention what this is doing to the trust we're supposed to be building in the community." The officer was suspended indefinitely, but the investigation didn't stop there. Civil rights organizations, emboldened by the footage, demanded a thorough inquiry into the officer's past actions. Soon, troubling patterns began to emerge, a history of racially charged complaints, allegations of excessive force, and several previous cases swept quietly under the rug. As the legal system moved into action, Mr. Carter filed a lawsuit against the officer and the department, citing racial profiling and excessive use of force. The lawsuit not only gained widespread media attention but also reignited conversations about police reform and accountability. The officer, now disgraced, found himself ostracized by both the public and his peers. His name became synonymous with abuse of power, his face plastered across headlines and social media posts. He avoided going out in public, fearing the judgment and anger of the community he had once claimed to serve. Eventually, the department announced his termination, citing violations of conduct unbecoming of an officer. Stripped of his badge and career, he faced further legal repercussions as the lawsuit progressed. For the officer, what began as a routine day at work had unraveled into the complete dismantling of his career. For the public, it was a small but significant victory, proof that even those in power could be held accountable for their actions. In the wake of the incident, a wave of support flooded in for the boy and his family. Local community members rallied around them, organizing events and fundraisers to show solidarity and to cover any legal expenses. Messages of encouragement poured in from across the nation, sent through letters, emails, and social media posts. The boy, who had felt so small and powerless in that moment of fear, began to understand just how many people were standing with him. The neighborhood organized a vigil in the park where the incident had occurred. Candles lined the paths, and people of all backgrounds gathered to honor the boy's strength and resilience. Mr. Carter, standing by his son's side, spoke to the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about my son," he said, looking out at the sea of faces. "This is about every child who has ever been made to feel less than, every family who has ever had to fight for justice. Today, we stand together to say, no more." The crowd erupted in applause, their unity shining through the darkness of what had happened. The boy, though still shaken, managed a small smile as he looked out at the people who had come to support him. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of belonging, a reassurance that he wasn't alone. Local businesses and organizations also stepped up. A local therapy center offered free counseling sessions for the boy to help him process the trauma he had endured. Schools in the area began holding workshops on racial equality and police interaction, using the incident as a painful but necessary starting point for change. National figures also took notice. Activists and public figures reached out to the family, amplifying their voices and using their platforms to draw attention to systemic issues of racism and abuse of power. A prominent civil rights leader even visited the boy's school, commending him for his courage and reminding him of his strength. The boy's story became a catalyst for change, inspiring other families to come forward with their own experiences. It was a reminder to the world that even in moments of darkness, community and solidarity could shine a light, offering hope and healing. For the boy and his family, the support they received became a source of strength. Though the trauma of that day would take time to heal, they knew they had the backing of a community that believed in justice, equality, and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable among them. The events that unfolded in the park that day became more than just a story of injustice. They became a powerful reminder of the need for accountability, empathy, and the fight against prejudice. For the boy and his family, it was a harrowing experience, but one that ultimately brought about a deeper awareness of the strength in unity and the power of standing up for what is right. The boy, though still healing, learned an invaluable lesson. Even in the face of fear and oppression, courage and resilience could spark change. He found strength in the unwavering support of his father and the community, realizing that his voice, though small at first, was part of a much larger call for justice. Mr. Carter, already a staunch advocate for civil rights, saw this personal battle as a painful but necessary example of why the fight against systemic racism and abuse of power must continue. "This wasn't just about my son," he often reminded those who asked. This is about every child, every individual who has ever been judged, harmed, or silenced because of who they are. For the wider community, the incident served as a wake-up call. It forced conversations about the biases that still linger within systems meant to protect and serve. It pushed for reforms, accountability, and greater awareness of the importance of fairness and equality in every corner of society. The officer's actions became a cautionary tale, a stark example of how unchecked prejudice can destroy careers and lives. But more importantly, it showed that those in positions of power could no longer act without consequences. The public demanded change, and the momentum created by the incident helped ignite discussions about policing reforms and racial justice on a broader scale. In the end, the story left a lasting imprint on all who witnessed or heard it. It reminded everyone that while the fight for justice may be long and difficult, it is one worth continuing. Through pain and adversity, there is the opportunity to rise stronger, to build bridges of understanding, and to create a world where no child, no person, has to endure such injustice ever again. For the boy, his family, and the community, the events of that day became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, the light of courage, solidarity, and the pursuit of justice could prevail. What do you think about this powerful and emotional story? Have you or someone you know ever experienced racism or witnessed prejudice? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your voice matters deeply to us. We value each and every one of you and are incredibly grateful for the time you spend with us here. Your support, through likes, comments, and subscriptions, helps us continue sharing important stories like this one. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community. Thank you for being here, and have a wonderful day filled with kindness and understanding.